At 7:40 in the morning on March 23, 2021, a container ship called the Ever Given was steaming north through the Suez Canal at 13.5 knots. That speed matters. The canal's legal limit is 7.5. The Ever Given was moving at nearly double the speed it was supposed to be moving, through one of the narrowest, most strategically important waterways on the planet. The ship was 400 meters long, almost exactly the height of the Empire State Building. It was carrying just over 20,000 shipping containers. Its destination was Rotterdam. 20,000 containers is not just a number, it's the combined seasonal inventory of hundreds of brands. Winter coats for half of Europe, next month's smartphones for 3 major retailers, raw materials for factories in Germany and Italy, refrigerated boxes whose contents will spoil if the transit gets delayed by even a couple of days. The cargo value on a ship that size easily tops $2 billion. Choosing Suez over the route around Africa saves 10 to 14 days and millions in fuel. But every container on board is betting that politics, tides, and pilotage will cooperate. That morning, none of them did. A sandstorm hit. Visibility collapsed. Wind gusts reached 40 knots. And for reasons that the official investigation would spend the next 2 years arguing about, the bridge crew lost control of the ship. At 7:41 a.m. Egypt time, the Ever Given wedged itself diagonally across the Suez Canal. For the next 6 days, 12% of global trade had nowhere to go. This is the story of how a single ship, a single sandstorm, and a single bad morning broke the world for nearly a week, and why, as you'll see by the end of this video, it was always going to happen. To understand why the Ever Given grounding mattered, you have to understand what the Suez Canal actually is. It's a 193-kilometer ditch through the Egyptian desert. That's it. A man-made trench, in places less than 300 meters wide, with no locks, where seawater flows freely between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. And it is, without exaggeration, the most important shortcut in the global economy. A container ship traveling from Shanghai to Rotterdam, like the Ever Given, has 2 choices. Through the Suez Canal, about 24 days. Around the southern tip of Africa, about 34 days. 10 extra days on every single voyage, on every single ship. For a single container ship, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars in fuel alone. Multiply that across the roughly 50 ships per day that transit the canal, about 18,000 ships per year, and you start to understand why Suez exists. Roughly 12% of all global trade passes through this single canal, around 30% of the world's container shipping, about 1 billion tons of cargo every year. Egypt earns nearly $7 billion annually just in transit fees. The canal is the single most valuable piece of infrastructure on the African continent, and arguably one of the most valuable on Earth. And here's the part that most people don't understand. The canal is not a highway, it's a single lane. Most of its length now allows 2-way transit, after a major expansion completed in 2015. But the southern section, where the Ever Given grounded, is still 1 lane only. That means if anything blocks that section, everything stops. Northbound traffic, southbound traffic, all of it. And when that southern section locks up, the real damage isn't measured in delayed ships, it's measured in factories. German automakers operate with 4 to 6 hours of parts on hand. Dutch chemical plants run continuous processes that can't simply be paused. British retailers bank on weekly container arrivals. Almost no one in modern logistics holds real buffer stock anymore. A 6-day blockage doesn't just raise costs. It forces assembly lines quiet. It clears supermarket shelves. It triggers panic airlifts at 10 times the normal price for cargo that simply cannot wait. While cargo owners make ruthless triage calls about which production shifts get cut, which customers hear that their order has just slipped 8 weeks, and which orders get written off entirely. The financial and operational ripples race far ahead of the ships. Long before the first delayed container reaches port, the damage is already done. But the truly strange thing, the thing nobody tells you when they talk about Suez, is that this dependence is not natural. It's not inevitable. It's the result of a 160-year-old decision made by a French diplomat with no engineering training, financed partly through the forced labor of 100,000 Egyptian workers who died building it. To understand the Ever Given, we have to go back 2,500 years. The idea of cutting a canal across this desert is 2,500 years old. Around 500 BC, the Persian conqueror Darius I began digging one. The Ptolemies who followed Alexander the Great finished a version of it, a 50-yard wide waterway linking the Red Sea to the Mediterranean via the Nile. Cleopatra probably rode it in her royal barge, but every version of that canal eventually silted up, was rebuilt, and silted up again. By the Islamic era, it had been abandoned entirely, and for the next 1,000 years, the question of whether to cut a permanent canal across the Suez Isthmus was debated, surveyed, and abandoned roughly once every century, partly because the engineers kept getting one critical detail wrong. They were convinced the Red Sea sat significantly higher than the Mediterranean. Cut a sea-level canal, they argued, and one would flood into the other, drowning the Nile Delta. Then, in 1798, Napoleon arrived. Napoleon brought engineers they surveyed. They reported back that, and you'll appreciate the consistency, the Red Sea was 30 feet higher than the Mediterranean. It wasn't. They had measured wrong. By the time French scientists figured this out, Napoleon had been chased out of Egypt, and the idea had been shelved again. It would take another 50 years, and one specific man to revive it. His name was Ferdinand de Lesseps. He was not an engineer. He was a French diplomat, and crucially, he had spent his early career in Egypt, where he had befriended the young prince, who would later become its ruler. In 1854, that prince, Sayed Pasha, became viceroy of Egypt. De Lesseps boarded a ship to Cairo. Within months, he had a concession to build the canal. What followed was one of the most consequential and most brutal engineering projects of the 19th century. The Suez Canal Company was formed in 1858. Construction began the following year, and for the first 4 years, the canal was dug almost entirely by hand, by Egyptian peasants conscripted under the corvée, a system of forced labor that the modern world would correctly recognize as slavery. Tens of thousands died. By the time the new ruler of Egypt, Ismail Pasha, abolished the corvée in 1864, the death toll was already catastrophic. The work continued with paid European labor and mechanical dredgers, but the human cost of the project would not stop accumulating. By the time the canal was completed in 1869, an estimated 100,000 Egyptian workers had died. On the 17th of November, 1869, the Suez Canal was officially opened. Empress Eugénie of France attended. Ferdinand de Lesseps was hailed across Europe as one of the greatest men of his century. The canal changed everything. The journey from London to Bombay was suddenly 40% shorter. Britain, which had originally opposed the canal because it was French, bought up Egypt's shares within 6 years and effectively controlled the waterway for the next 90 years. And then, in 1956, the new ruler of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, did something nobody in London or Paris had thought possible. He nationalized it. What followed was a brief, disastrous war. Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt to seize the canal back. The United States and the Soviet Union, for once aligned, forced them to withdraw within months. The Suez Crisis is now remembered as the moment the British Empire ended. Britain had built the modern world on the assumption that it controlled this waterway. It didn't. After 1956, it never would again. By the time the Ever Given entered the canal on March 23, 2021, the Suez Canal had survived 2,500 years of attempts, the collapse of empires, 2 world wars, and a crisis that ended British imperial power. What it could not survive was 40-knot winds and a 400-meter ship moving too fast. When the Ever Given lodged itself across the southern section of the canal, the response was almost immediate and almost completely inadequate. By the morning of March 24th, 8 tugboats were trying to push the Ever Given back into the channel. They were vastly underpowered for the task. The ship weighed 224,000 tons. The tugs could not move it. The Suez Canal Authority brought in a specialized suction dredger and began excavating around the bow, which was lodged deep into the eastern bank. They calculated that they would need to remove around 30,000 cubic meters of sand and clay to free the ship. Meanwhile, ships kept arriving. By March 25th, 50 vessels were stranded. By the 26th, over 100. By the 28th, 5 days into the blockage, 369 ships were waiting on both sides of the canal, with more arriving every hour. The final count would reach over 430 vessels. In shipping company headquarters around the world, the decisions were brutal and fast. 27 ships gave up waiting and turned south, around the Cape of Good Hope, a detour that would add 7 to 10 days to their voyages. For their cargo owners, that was the easy choice. The hard ones were happening elsewhere. When the canal locked shut, the fleet math turned brutal. Within days, shipping lines faced a brutal Asia to Europe container imbalance. Thousands of loaded boxes stranded westbound, while Europe screamed for empty units to feed its export surge. Maersk alone had 69 vessels caught in the chaos, and a later academic study estimated the cost to Maersk's fleet at $89 million. 76 million of that just in inventory carrying costs. You couldn't simply wait. Every idle day knocked an entire weekly rotation out of sync across networks with zero slack capacity. Some lines diverted via the Cape, swallowing an extra 3,000 nautical miles and $2 to $4 million in fuel per ultra-large vessel. Others frantically transshipped through Singapore or Dubai, spawning equipment shortages that would echo through the Pacific for the next 4 months. The tightly wound global network had no give left. By March 26th, financial markets were responding. Brent crude rose 6% in 3 days. Insurance premiums for canal transit jumped. Maersk warned customers that even after the canal reopened, the disruption would take weeks to clear. On the ground at the canal, the Dutch salvage firm Royal Boskalis had taken over. They began bringing in heavier equipment. They calculated that if the dredging didn't work, they would need to start removing containers from the ship, a process that could prolong the blockage by weeks, possibly months. What saved them, in the end, was the moon. On the night of March 28th, a spring tide, caused by the alignment of the sun and the moon during the full moon, raised the water level in the canal by about 18 inches. With the extra buoyancy, the combined effort of 14 tugboats, and the partial excavation of the bank, the salvage team managed to swing the stern of the Ever Given free. By the morning of March 29th, 6 days, 7 hours, and several $1 million in salvage costs after she ran aground, the Ever Given was floating again. She was towed to the Great Bitter Lake, a wide section of the canal, and anchored there for inspection. The canal reopened. Within a few days, the backlog of over 400 ships had been pushed through, with peak transit days exceeding 100 ships, well above the canal's normal capacity. But the story wasn't over, not even close. When most people remember the Ever Given, they remember the 6 days, the viral images, the little excavator next to the giant ship. What they don't remember, because most coverage stopped when the canal reopened, is that the 6 days were just the beginning. Here's what actually happened over the following months. When 400 ships are released from the canal at once, they don't arrive at their destinations gradually. They arrive in waves. European ports, particularly Rotterdam, Hamburg, and Antwerp, had been planning their crane and labor capacity around the normal flow of about 50 ships per day. Suddenly they faced a compressed surge. Terminals overflowed, containers stacked up faster than trucks and trains could remove them. Wait times for ship berths in Rotterdam stretched from hours to days. Some ships sat in queues outside European ports for over a week, fully loaded, unable to unload. And these weren't just any ships. They were the ships carrying the cargo that had already been delayed 6 days at Suez. Their cargo owners were already past contractual deadlines, already on the phone with customers, already losing money. The surge after the canal reopened shattered what was left of the fragile balance. Loaded boxes flooded into Europe, while tens of thousands of empties piled up on the wrong side of the world. Shanghai to Rotterdam spot rates, which had already tripled in late 2020, doubled again to over $7,400 by late March. They kept climbing. By summer 2021, rates were touching $12,000 to $14,000 per container, more than 10 times pre-pandemic levels. Lines burned millions repositioning empty containers from Europe back to Asia at premium costs, and still couldn't feed the next sailings. That imbalance turned a 6-day blockage into the spark that ignited the full 2021 global container famine. Bookings became lotteries. No amount of money guaranteed space 3 weeks out. The network had finally run out of elastic, and the Ever Given itself didn't leave Egypt for over 3 months. The Suez Canal Authority impounded her on April 13th, demanding $900 million in damages for the canal repairs, lost transit fees, and the salvage operation. The final settlement came in around $540 million. The ship didn't sail again until July 7th, 106 days after she grounded. She finally reached Rotterdam on July 29th, 4 months later than scheduled. Her cargo, by then, was already a story most of her customers had moved on from. The headline figure that circulated in news coverage at the time was $9 billion per day in delayed trade. Multiplied across 6 days, that's the $54 billion in the title of this video. But that number, like most headline numbers, undersells what actually happened. The real cost, counting the months of port congestion, the rate explosion, the inventory write-offs, the missed seasonal selling windows, the production halts at factories from Wolfsburg to Sunderland, almost certainly ran into the hundreds of billions. And here's what makes this story matter beyond a single incident. Nothing about the fragility that produced it has been fixed. The Suez Canal handles 12% of global trade. The Strait of Hormuz handles a fifth of the world's oil. The Strait of Malacca, between Indonesia and Malaysia, handles roughly a quarter of global maritime trade. The Panama Canal, the Bosporus, the Strait of Gibraltar, Bab el-Mandeb. Every one of them is a single point of failure. The modern global economy has been designed, very deliberately, around the assumption that these choke points remain open. We've optimized for efficiency, for just-in-time delivery, for thinner inventories, for longer supply chains across more borders. Every gain in efficiency has come at the cost of resilience. The Ever Given was not an aberration. It was a preview. A 400-meter ship traveling too fast. A sandstorm. 6 days. $54 billion and months of aftershocks. When the next choke point fails, and it will, the question won't be whether the global economy is fragile. We already know that. The question will be whether we are paying attention to the system we have built. This is Causeway. I'll see you on the next episode.